All right. We are hopefully going to finish the review we started a couple of weeks ago. I'd hoped to finish it in one session that night, but we didn't. And so we're going to kind of speed back to where we were. We're pausing because we finished a section in the book to try and remind us where we are. I'm a big believer in outlines because they help me stay focused, because you can kind of get lost in the details sometimes. And so what we've kind of done is just back up and see what's going on. This is the outline of 1st and 2nd Kings as I see it. And again, outlines to a degree are somewhat subjective, right? It depends upon the individual, and there are debates about where that should be, where the line demarcation should be. But this is the one that we're following, and like I say, in 5 years, I may outline this thing completely different. So we've been in Solomon's reign in 1 Kings, and then the kingdom divides in 12 through 16. The event takes place in 12, and then it kind of solidifies in the oncoming chapters. And then that 17 through 8, that's 1 Kings 17 through 2 Kings 8, the section we just finished is about the kings versus the prophets. And primarily the prophets being Elijah and Elisha versus the house of Ahab. And they're going to come to a swift end here momentarily in chapter 9 when we begin this final section of the book where the road to exile just kind of picks up steam like a freight train going downhill. So, I forgot I did this, sorry. These were just chapter summaries of each of these sections as we saw Solomon's reign, and then the split solidified in Judah and Israel. And then Elijah is announcing judgment on Israel. He retreats in 19:20. You've got announcement of judgment on Ahab. And again in 21 after Naboth's vineyard. Naboth's vineyard is going to come up again here in our chapter, in chapter 9. God is going to execute justice for Ahab and Jezebel's. You remember, they murdered Naboth in order to have his field. And we spent some significant time there talking about the importance of land inheritance. It wasn't like Naboth just owned a field and was being difficult and didn't turn it over. He, before God, could not forfeit his land. Because the way it was designed in the law was that the land belonged to God and that you couldn't just hand it to anybody you wanted to. It had to be passed down to successive generations. And so, anyway, he is murdered, and actually so are his sons, anyone who could have inherited that property. And that's when Elijah says to Ahab, "You're finished. You're going to die for this." And of course, he does at the end of the book, but also his family is going to be wiped out. And that doesn't happen until we get into this final section in chapter 9. And then in 22, Micaiah announces judgment on Ahab again, and of course he dies in that battle with the Syrians. Then as we come into 2 Kings, Elijah is announcing judgment on Ahaziah, who is one of the sons of Ahab. You remember, he's sick, and he goes to ask counsel of a foreign deity instead of seeking counsel from God. And so he is judged for that particular movement. And then Elijah ascends back into heaven, turns the ministry over to Elisha, and then you go through this Elisha being established firmly as Elijah's successor, and then you have this cluster of miracles that take place. And then you have the Elisha and the Ben-Hadad. You remember Elisha is turning over information to the king of Israel about Ben-Hadad, the Syrian king's movements. And therefore Ben-Hadad wants to kill Elisha in the process, and of course that does not work. Then Elisha and the Israelite king, the besieging of Samaria and his deliverance there. And then we return to the kings of Judah. So from 1 Kings 15 all the way up until 2 Kings 8:16, the focus has been on Ahab and his sons as rulers in Israel. Okay? And it momentarily moves back to Judah, and what it highlights about the kings of Judah is they have intermarried with the family of Ahab. And so that's going to ultimately lead to their downfall as well, because Ahab and his family and Jezebel are known for Baal worship. And so that's going to come back around and haunt them. That's how it kind of makes its way into the south. They had some problems with idolatry, but nothing like Baal worship. All right. We talked about the rise of Israel. That's what we're calling our study, the rise and ruin of Israel. 2 Samuel, David extends its borders. Saul was he wasn't very successful in many ways. And one way was he didn't really expand the borders. He could not win wars, most of the time because he was an egomaniac and trying to kill David, and so he had no time to actually fight for his nation. He just fought his own personal wars. So David expands the borders and makes them what God had always intended them to be. And then you needed Solomon's reign to, whereas David was the warrior, you needed Solomon to be an administrator. You see, I think we talked about this when we got here. You need different leaders for different times. Okay? And sometimes leaders have to know when it's their time to step aside, because what I can offer is not what they need right now. They need this. And so with David, they needed a warrior king. They needed someone who could make them safe. But David's time was over. They were safe. Now they needed somebody who could bring everything together and get it organized into a system that would operate in a way that made sense. All right? We talked about their problems with idolatry. Solomon introduces it. Jeroboam moves calf worship, and then it goes to Baal worship, and it just goes downhill from there. Then the constant theme also is in rejecting God's word. In 18, after God shows himself to be faithful, they don't do it. God tells Ahab to kill Ben-Hadad. In 20, he doesn't do it. The war with Syria, he told him not to go. He went anyway. Seeking foreign deities, they're going to other gods to get their information, not finishing the job that God has given them to do in chapter 3, and not believing him that God would deliver them. And so it's just this constant movement of God is speaking, and they're doing the direct opposite, or just refusing to do it. And we talked about there the importance of, if we're honest, that's kind of a mirror. Because God has been pretty plain about quite a few things, and we just kind of look at it and go, I mean, we don't do it that way, but that's what we're doing. The Bible is not a book that's meant to be merely studied for intellectual advancement. It's meant to be implemented. And one of the principal rules of Bible study is that until it is applied, your Bible study is not complete. Okay? Because part of that Bible study process is moving to application. And then, so in application, you're looking at what it would look like in real life if I did this. And then you're giving yourself 2 or 3 options of how to kind of execute this. And so this is a little closer to home than I know I would care to admit sometimes. Then there's the issue of violence. They seek to kill Elijah. Jezebel does. She kills tons of God's prophets. Obadiah saves about 100 of them. Naboth is killed. His blood is spilled on the ground. And so violence is... So you see all these different things are coming about. They're not in successive order, but when you take a step back from the text and you look at it, you can start piecing it together. You got your violence. You got idolatry. When you reject God through idolatry and you reject his word, it's not long before you start making up your own rules. This is Romans 1. We kind of talked about this. Romans 1 is kind of a microcosm of this, that it just expands on the fact that when you cease to be thankful for who God is and for what he's done, you exchange the truth of God for the lie. And once that starts, you get your idols, and then you get all different types of depravity and debauchery that go on, and it's a slow process of decay. It's a very ugly downward spiral. And so what we're looking at is that take place right in front of our eyes. Now, where I want us to pick up tonight, and this is where we left off, just a few of these, why this matters. So a lot of people struggle with the Old Testament and why it should be relevant to us today. We can't go into everything about that. I've done some writing on that. I've had to write on that for school. So I do have some papers that deal with that a little bit more extensively, where I make arguments there. But I just want to restrict them to what we see in this book as to why. Not kind of go everywhere the way I do in some other writings, but in this book why this matters. Well, I love to read. So how many of us, when I go pick up a book or when you go pick up a book, how many people start by picking it up and going, let's see, 2/3 of the way through, and then you just start reading there? I mean, you can do it, but you're going to be as lost as an Easter egg. You're not going to know what's going on. So first of all, when you look at it, just common sense, you're skipping 2/3 of the Bible when you leave the Old Testament behind. Furthermore, one of the things that you begin to realize is that the New Testament, is built on and predicated with allusions and quotations and images and language that is filled with the Old Testament that become painfully obvious when you realize what the Old Testament says. You start to see it. Revelation, what's interesting about Revelation is there are 0 Old Testament quotations in Revelation. But there are several hundred allusions where the imagery is the same, right? The way we understand Revelation, the reason why so many people miss Revelation by a mile is because they don't know the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the grid for interpreting Revelation. That's where the imagery comes from. And so you have to have it. As a matter of fact, Elijah and Elisha, they come up in Revelation. Their images are used in the Revelation with the 2 prophets who are slain and left in the street. And so there are so many things that just cannot be understood without the use of the Old Testament, one of which being, in my argument, is the very first verse of the New Testament. This is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, if you forget the Old Testament, who in the world is he talking about? And why is it significant? I can't tell you. Because that one verse is packed with information when you study the promises to Abraham and to David. And to do that, you got to get into Genesis. You got to get into 2 Samuel. So, as we think about it as it relates to 1 and 2 Kings, the Old Testament, this is what the New Testament says about the Old Testament, okay? These are just a couple of these quotations. Romans 15:4 is pretty well known, although contextually it isn't always conveyed correctly. But he says, what was written before time was written for our learning, that we through patience or endurance and comfort from the Scriptures might have hope. One of the reasons we use the Old Testament is you look at people, when you're suffering, you look at someone like Job and say, if he can survive that, I can survive this. If God sustained him then, he'll sustain me now. It teaches me about who God is. His attributes become very real. You see them on display, and so you need them. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, when Paul is making an argument about Christian liberty issues, he quotes from the wilderness wandering issues in the book of Numbers. I think he may allude to Exodus, but the majority of them will be Numbers. And he says, these things were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world have come, or the ends of the ages. What he means is this is the final dispensation. This is what God was always working toward, was the Christian dispensation. And so these things were written for our admonition, to look at them and to see their mistakes and not repeat them. Okay? Now, some people, and I guess it just depends on the way you're wired in some ways. I got spanked when I was a kid. Not as much as my older brother, but I got spanked. Now, the reason why I received significantly less than him was I could look at what he was doing and go, that's not going to end well. I know how this ends. Okay? Think about it. Learning from the experience of others is one of the smartest things you can do. Okay? Why is it we tell our kids when the stove is up and they want to kind of touch the stove, the top, and touch an eye, don't touch that, it's hot. And they keep wanting to touch it. Now, you can either take their word for it that is hot. You can burn your hand. I mean, that's your choice. And so when we look at the Old Testament is not meant for us to look at it and say, look how terrible these people were. The Old Testament is kind of like a mirror that says, you know what, I see myself in here everywhere. The mistakes that they made, I make them. Every one of them. Complaining in the wilderness, lack of trust in God, going into idolatry. I mean, they're everywhere. So the Old Testament is given to us to learn and to see how these things come out, because a great deal of the Old Testament is composed of two different types of literature. It's either history or poetry, okay? And so both of those books, in history, you kind of see what happens and you see how it plays out. In poetry, you kind of get a commentary on the way that stuff played out in history. So, next, without 1st and 2nd Kings, we don't understand Samaria and Judea. Why is it when you come to the New Testament, Jesus is all of a sudden talking to a woman of Samaria? And why is Samaria considered this whole region? Because I've never really heard of it before. Who are the Samaritans? Where did they come from? Well, we're going to run into them in 2 Kings 17. The origins of Samaritans are here. When some of the Israelites stay and they intermarry with people from other nations and they create a half-breed, so to speak. And then in the time of Nehemiah, they want to try and help rebuild the wall, and Nehemiah won't let them. And so that animosity is created between Jews and Gentiles that carries on even into the day of Jesus. Judea and Samaria are separate. Matter of fact, the book of Acts could be outlined by Acts 1 and verse 8, when Jesus says, you'll be witnesses to me both in Judea, Jerusalem, and then in Judea, and then into Samaria, and into the uttermost parts of the earth. That's exactly how the book spins. The gospel in Jerusalem, the gospel in Judea, the gospel in Samaria, and then all the way to the ends of the earth, which is the head of the Roman Empire in Rome. And so, but without this, we don't understand any of that. Furthermore, how do you understand who are the Pharisees, Sadducees, and this group of people that are never mentioned in the New Testament called the Essenes? And why don't you ever see the Essenes in the New Testament? Who are the Herodians? So, when we ignore this kind of stuff, the New Testament, we can botch it pretty badly. Next, in this, what about this temple? Okay? So this temple imagery that's spoken of, so the tabernacle, of course, was the tent in the wilderness, but Solomon built the temple in 1 Kings 6. Now, is that the same temple that we read about with Jesus? No. Because in our book, at the end of this book, that temple is going to be destroyed. And then in Ezra and Nehemiah, Zerubbabel is going to rebuild that temple. And then Herod the Great, in the time of Jesus, is going to be renovating that temple. Okay? In John chapter 2, when Jesus says, they said, show us a sign that you have the authority to do these things. Jesus says, destroy this temple and I'll build it in 3 days. And they said, this temple has been 46 years in building. Will you destroy it and rebuild it in 3 days? Now, he was talking about his body. They thought he was talking about the structure. Why was that temple destroyed? Why is it that in Matthew 24, 1 through 35, Jesus goes through this long discussion that a lot of people think is talking about the end of the world? It's not talking about the end of the world at all. It's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, the signs and the wars and the rumors of wars. That has nothing to do with the end of time. Nothing. But you know why people jump there? Because they won't touch the Old Testament. That Matthew 24 is apocalyptic literature, just like Revelation is. And the grid for interpreting it is the Old Testament. So why is it that Jesus says this temple is going to be destroyed? Why is it that the veil was torn from top to bottom when Jesus died on the cross? Why did Paul pick up on that imagery in Hebrews and say that in Hebrews chapter 10 that God had created through the flesh of Jesus, he had opened the way for us to now have direct access to Jesus? What does that mean? Where does it come from? And people say, well, I could probably piece something together. You might be able to piece something together, but you will miss the grand imagery, the grand working of God if you ignore the Old Testament. We'll miss it every single time. And so the temple imagery that we see built in this particular book in 1 Kings chapter 6 through 8 makes the New Testament make a lot more sense. The principles of king and kingdom. Why did they, ultimately, what was the reason why they rejected Jesus? Other than their sinfulness and they didn't want to believe, what was their idea of who Messiah was supposed to be? King. Where'd they get that idea from? I mean, I'm not a genius, but 1st and 2nd Kings seems to make a lot of sense. Because those were considered the good days. So surely Messiah is going to be, you remember we've talked about in this book that all these kings, no matter how good they are, they kind of build you up and then they just crash and let you down. And we've talked about how they get us ready for a king who will come, who will build us up but won't let us down. I mean, that's what this is about. Why, when Jesus is crucified, did they put above his head in 3 languages, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews"? So to understand why they even reject Jesus, why the apostles have such a hard time understanding what Jesus is saying. You remember in Matthew 16 when Peter makes the good confession and Jesus promises to build his church. And then in the very next paragraph, he begins to tell them that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders and be killed. And what does Peter do to him? I'm going to paraphrase. You don't know what you're talking about. That's not going to happen. Why did Peter feel that way? Because in his mind, the framework for Messiah would not allow. Messiah can't die. He has to live, and everybody else has to die. So, I mean, just the basic underpinnings of the gospel are tied even to what we're studying right here. All right, just a couple more. Solomon. Matthew 12:42. The queen of the south will rise up in judgment of this generation and condemn it, because she came from the uttermost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Behold, a greater than Solomon is here. Or Matthew 6 in the Sermon on the Mount. Yet, if God so clothes the grass of the field, and he takes care of the grass of the field, and Solomon in all of his glory was not arrayed like one of these, what does he mean? Why is Jesus greater than Solomon? How could he be greater than Solomon? Solomon was an extremely wealthy guy. Jesus never owned his own home. You and I would have looked at Jesus in an American culture and said, he needs to get a job. That's what we would have said to him. Doesn't sound like Solomon to me. Then you've got Elijah. What about all of this Mount of Transfiguration, and Elijah and Moses appear with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration? Don't you think it's significant that both of those men, Moses and Elijah, are connected to Sinai in 1 Kings 19 and in Exodus 32 to 34, where they have experiences with God and God's presence is known to them? What about Luke 4 when Jesus rebukes the people of his hometown for not believing the way that other Gentiles did in the days of Elijah? What about the importance of prayer when the half-brother of Jesus, the physical half-brother of Jesus, James, wrote and said, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man has much. And here's the illustration. Elijah prayed that it might not rain, and it did not rain on the earth for the space of 3 years and 6 months. He prayed again, and the earth gave its rain. That's the illustration he uses to show us that prayer works. Ignore the Old Testament, you got no idea what he's talking about. Then you've got the image of Elisha, which is, of course, mentioned again in Luke 24, and there are a lot of parallels between Elisha and other things in the New Testament. So, I'm just a strong believer in this. That what we're doing is not just studying kings and people dying for the sake of studying kings and people dying. Because sometimes people say, let's talk about the New Testament. That's the covenant we're under. But that assumes you can understand the new covenant without the old. And I am absolutely convinced that you can't. Tons of images. Matthew's gospel, best of luck to you without the Old Testament. It's modeled after the Old Testament. It's written to Jews, presenting Jesus as a new Moses, as a new Israel. No chance. Hebrews, no chance. Romans, no chance. 2 Corinthians, in many ways, no chance. Galatians, definitely, no chance. And so it's not, and I understand that the Old Testament can be difficult. But just because something is difficult, what I've found is many things that are difficult in life are the things that produce the greatest results. The things that were the hardest were the ones where I learned the most. And so, as we watch this take place, just remember that all of this stuff is leading us into the New Testament. It's touching the New Testament, even if we don't always. And listen, when we went through this, if I were to give you every image in these books that are picked up in the New Testament, we'd go slower than we are right now. We'd go slower than we are right now. So that's why I kind of wanted to stop and to kind of take a step back and us all remind ourselves why it is that we're looking at this stuff. And it's not just because I have a desire to teach what most people consider to be boring books. It's because they're legitimate and they have a lot to teach us. So anyway, didn't plan on taking that long. But anyway, chapter 9, next week, Jehu. We're going to see him. We'll probably go through 9 and get to part of 10 because 9 and 10 are a whole unit when we talk about this interesting guy named Jehu and what God does through him and how it connects us back to even 1 Kings. So we'll pick up there next Wednesday night.